Amidst all the celebrations of the 500th anniversary of Luther's call for a debate on the matter of indulgences, there is a spectre which haunts some of the more thoughtful discussions and reflections about the 16th century Protestant revolt. Has it proved ultimately to be less a glorious staging post in the history of humanity's ascent to freedom, and more the opening of a Pandora's box of evils, which has impoverished culture, undermined religious faith, and paved the way for the various malaises of modernity? The traditional Protestant understanding of our own history is, of course, one of liberation, a tale of progressive and positive developments. So, thus Luther helped to shatter the religious monopoly of a corrupt and decadent church, and various good things slowly but surely emerged from this. Notions of equality, political freedom, rising literacy, the intrinsic value of ordinary life, modern science, etc. By contrast, the Church of Rome was seen to be reactionary and to have come to accept only very late freedoms which Protestantism took for granted. As British analytic philosopher Anthony Kenny recounts in his autobiography, as late as the 1950s, he as a priest, a Roman Catholic priest, had to obtain special permission from his church to read David Hume as part of his doctoral research. I like to point out to my Roman Catholic friends that Elvis had already done his greatest work by the time Roman Catholics were allowed to read David Hume. Yet that narrative is now under severe strain. As I will argue in my conclusion, a large part of this comes from the fact that the Western culture which Protestantism helped to form is now itself seen, at least by many traditionally religious people, as being itself under severe strain. The dissolution of traditional sexual mores, the banality of a daily life shaped by consumerism, the weakening of such basic principles as freedom of speech, the increasing weakness of the nation-state, the loss of any sense of transcendence, a widespread moral relativism, and the general feeling of decadence, pointless busyness, and boredom mark contemporary life. So come now then to some of the, three particular critics of the traditional narrative of Protestant progress. And because I'm going to say some quite critical things about these three scholars, I want to say at the outset, these are three men whose work I've greatly appreciated over the years, and indeed found extremely helpful on numerous points, though perhaps not on the point that I'm addressing this afternoon. Three influential critics of the traditional narrative are the philosopher Charles Taylor and the historians Brad Gregory and Carlos Ira. All of these are writers from the last decade. Elements of their basic critique, however, are of much older vintage. I suspect Max Weber is arguably the most significant source for critiques of the Reformation. Should not focus so much on the theological and ecclesiastical results, so much as the sociological. Weber's work is the key to the notion that the modern world is disenchanted, and that it is Protestantism, particularly in its reformed variant, which is central to this, and which was, as it happens, the religion of his own mother. There's all kinds of psychological stuff one could get into there, I'm sure. It is to Weber that we owe the idea that Protestantism disenchanted the world and paved the way for the prosaic existence which he observed in the industrialized Germany of his own day. To a large extent, Weber's basic thesis continues to set the terms of debate down to the present. Charles Taylor's approach to the question of secularization connects to Weber in that disenchantment, the point he takes as basic for any understanding, is a point that he takes as basic for the understanding of the intellectual and cultural conditions of the modern Western world. To this, he also adds a number of other ingredients. The element of choice in religion is also an obvious legacy of the Protestant Reformation. The chaotic marketplace of religions which we have today is, for Taylor, a hallmark of the secular age, even though we might typically see the ideas of religion and the secular as antithetical. These, according to Taylor, find their origins in the religious world of the late Middle Ages and the Reformation. He sees the Protestantism of the Reformation as pressing religious renewal in three key areas: the turn to a more inward and intense personal devotion, a greater uneasiness at sacramental and church-controlled magic, and the new inspiring idea of salvation by faith, which erupted into a world riven with anxiety about judgment and a sense of unworthiness. The net result, expressed with greater nuance, and it's Charles Taylor, greater prolixity than Weber, is disenchantment. While Taylor acknowledges that the initial impulse of the Reformation was to expand the sacred to cover all of life, and thus had a universal sacralizing tendency, this was precariously balanced over against an emphasis on personal sanctification, which ultimately had the opposite effect and stripped the sacred away from the public sphere. Religion's significance lay in its inward, we might say private significance, not in its outward impact on the ordering of society. Brad Gregory's contribution to plunging the narrative of Protestant triumph into crisis is his immensely detailed and learned volume, The Unintended Reformation. Gregory's approach is far more polemical in style than Taylor. It is clear from the outset that he regards many of the products of modernity, above all its chaotic moral relativism, as absolutely deplorable, and there is little doubt whom he regards as being to blame. Quotations from his introduction give the sense of his overall thesis. First, and I quote, "This book's principal argument is that the Western world today is an extraordinarily complex, tangled product of rejections, retentions, and transformations of medieval Western Christianity, in which the Reformation era constitutes the critical watershed." And second, I quote again, "My point of departure is therefore the banal observation that human life in the Western world today, and perhaps most obviously in the United States, is characterized by an enormously wide range of incompatible truth claims pertaining to human values, aspirations, norms, morality, and meaning." Dr. Gregory is not a happy man, I would suggest. For Gregory, the cacophony of modern life can be traced back to what he describes as the watershed moment of the Reformers. The consequences might well be, as the subtitle of his book suggests, unintended, but they are nonetheless directly related to the intellectual and ecclesiastical moves made by the Reformers of the 16th century. Given the more narrow focus of his book, Gregory's analysis is considerably more detailed than that of Taylor. The primary culprits for him are to be found in the metaphysics, which the Reformers made normative, and from which modernity sprang. Two aspects of this are particularly worthy of note. First, nominalism undermined the idea of the unity of knowledge, leading to the fragmentation and eventual functional autonomy of different areas of study. Second, and related to the first, an emphasis on the univocity of being, which emerged in Duns Scotus and was radicalized by William of Ockham, served to undermine ultimately any notion of God's transcendence. This provided a metaphysical grounding for the collapse of the distinction between the sacred and the secular, as well as leading to the anti-sacramentalism of the Reformers. To these two, and perhaps Gregory doesn't make too much of this, but it occurs in other critics of the Reformation, we might also add the role of voluntarism, though Gregory does not highlight this in particular, but also seem that the emergence in the late medieval period of voluntaristic notions of God's absolute power might serve to weaken sacramentalism by rendering sacramental efficacy a matter of mere divine whim. Carlos Eira makes his contribution to the crisis of the received Reformation narrative in a fascinating article in 2014, Incombustible Weber, How the Protestant Reformation Really Disenchanted the World. Here, Eira defends Weber's basic thesis, that Protestantism was instrumental in disenchanting the world, but defends it in a matter which rejects the simple dichotomy of magic versus religion, which Weber used, and which informed many of the earlier critiques of Weber's theory, such as those offered by Robert Scribner. Eira offers three avenues for seeing the world disenchanting impulses of Protestantism. First, Protestantism drove a wedge between matter and spirit in a way that forced the supernatural out of the natural and denied access to the divine via the material. Second, and following from the first, Protestantism redrew the relationship between the supernatural and the natural. The two obvious consequences of this were the rejection of the continuation of miracles and the denial of mystical ecstasy as a means of union with God. Third, Protestantism severed the realms of the living and the dead. No longer could prayers be offered on behalf of the dead. No longer would the dead intercede for the living. The two realms were distinct and had no practical relevance for each other. Ira's defense of Weber's basic thesis is thus nuanced and sophisticated, avoiding any discussion of the nebulous and contentious concept of magic, while yet making it clear that Reformation Protestantism involved fundamental changes in thought which had significant and obvious implications for the way the natural world was understood in relation to the supernatural. It would certainly seem that disenchanting would be a legitimate term for describing that which Ira articulates. These three figures, Taylor, Gregory, and Ira, make learned and compelling cases for the significance of Protestantism for modern secularization. Yet it would seem to me that the cases they make are not invulnerable to criticism. So first, I would like to offer some general comments by way of making the question they seek to answer more complicated than they have allowed. And second, I want to look specifically at Martin Luther, or perhaps even better at the absence of Martin Luther, and ask if the very fountainhead of Reformation Protestantism is thus guilty of the crimes with which the movement he inspired is charged. I'm not going to be able to deal with everything that Ira, Gregory, and Taylor say, but I'm going to pick out some salient points. General reflections. One of the striking things about the work of Taylor, Gregory, and Ira is the lack of reflection upon the role of technology in the transformation of the world. The historical narratives they espouse are fundamentally idealist ones. It is commendable that they take ideas seriously. I spent my entire career taking ideas seriously. I could hardly criticize them for that. But that to which they point, the disenchantment of modernity in the secular world, is defined not simply or even primarily, I think, by intellectual attitudes, but by patterns of behavior that are inextricably connected to certain material conditions. It's Gregory who makes the case for the primacy of ideas most explicitly, and he says, I quote, "Beliefs influence behavior, whether among the old order Amish or the new atheists, and beliefs differ radically. A hyperpluralism of religious and secular commitments, not any shared or convergent view about what we think is true or right or good, marks the early 21st century." End quote. There's nothing I can disagree with in that statement. But I would want to add that material conditions also shape behavior and shape how people think, often in very profound and important ways. Research on contemporary sexual mores, and sexual mores are perhaps the textbook example of the transformation of the world which Gregory decries, has made this clear. I'm thinking of Mark Regnus's book published just 2-3 weeks ago, Cheap Sex, where he looks at the economics of sex and how that connects to sexual technology. The advent of cheap and effective contraception, and more recently vast amounts of privately accessible internet pornography, have transformed sexual practices and the understanding of what sex means. I can imagine arguments being made that the reformers, in the denying marriage was a sacrament, somehow secularized and disenchanted the institution. But it really made no difference until the advent of the pill in the 1960s. Thus, any account of the mindsets of modernity has to take into account the material conditions of modernity. Second, Taylor, true to what I take to be his engaging and fundamentally optimistic philosophy, does not really, I think, in reading him, evaluate modernity and find it wanting, rather seeks merely to explain how our world has come to be. Ira and Gregory, however, are clear that the results of disenchantment are highly problematic. Particularly Gregory makes very explicit his dislike of the current state of American culture. Hey, I'm an Englishman living in America. I like living there, but I do dislike the culture as well. I have to say I'm sympathetic with that part of his thesis. To hold the position of critic is, of course, legitimate, and often makes for more interesting analysis than mere detached description can offer. And yet it does also beg some significant questions. The most obvious is, how does one separate those things of which one approves in modernity from those of which one disapproves? For example, it is indisputable that Protestantism helped to shatter the social and political structures of authority in medieval Europe. But was this a good thing or a bad thing? The moral anarchy we see around us in the West today may well be the descendant of the Protestant revolt, but history has not thrown up many attractive alternative approaches to political questions. Connected to this, we might also highlight other aspects of the modern world which provide the basic framework for the relativist anarchy which Gregory and Ira rightly, I think, decry. The social aspiration to universal education, an enlarged democratic franchise, and the notion of individual rights and freedoms, these too find their ultimate origins in the Reformation by no more and no less complicated a genealogy. But are they necessarily bad things? And can one have them without at least not running the risk of that which Gregory and Ira lament? Students sometimes say to me, "You're a historian, Dr. Trueman. Which era of history would you like to live in?" And I always say the present. I didn't want to grow up. My father, his earliest memories were running to the bomb shelter in Birmingham to avoid the Blitz. I don't want to live in an era before flush toilets and antibiotics. I'm kind of soft that way. Modernity is a pretty good thing in many ways. Take the issue of literacy. The call to teach people to read was a basic element of the Reformers' programme. Read the books of the Scottish Books of Discipline, for example, and that for obviously Protestant reasons. Tyndale's claim that he wanted even the ploughboy, possibly an apocryphal ascription to him, but the traditional claim ascribed to Tyndale that he wanted even the ploughboy to know more of Scripture than the priest might well be apocryphal, but it reflects a basic Protestant aspiration. All should be able to read so that all can read the Bible. That is because Protestantism is a religion of words, spoken words and written words. Clearly this is what Luther is assuming when he encourages Peter Beskendorf, the Wittenberg barber, in how to revive his prayer life, and I quote, "First, when I feel that I have become cool and joyless in prayer because of other tasks or thoughts, for the flesh and the devil always impede and obstruct prayer, I take my little psalter and I hurry to my room, or if it be the day and the hour for it, to the church where a congregation is assembled, and as time permits, I say quietly to myself and word for word, the Ten Commandments, the Creed, and if I have some time, some words of Christ or of Paul, or some psalms, just as a child might do." End quote. While preaching and vernacular liturgy at the heart of the Protestant Reformation, reading the Bible is a priority too. And yet this is where the matter surely becomes complicated. It is hard to imagine that the critics of the standard Reformation narrative would also lament the fact that we live in the West in a world where there is a much higher degree of literacy than the 16th century. Yet that is both the result of Protestantism and something which brings in its wake a host of the kind of problems highlighted by contemporary critics. Contemporary research into literacy indicates that there is a connection, albeit often a somewhat complicated one, between rising literacy rates and a rise in political self-consciousness. There's a very good UNESCO report available on the web, I think from 2011, that presents a summary of this research. To put it bluntly, that means that rising literacy rates bring with them always a risk, and often pose a fundamental challenge to the structures of authority at the time. If literacy increases, it is highly likely that a challenge to, or even a crisis in authority, is not far away. I think South America in the 1960s provided some good examples of this, where literacy in population was rising and they became left-wing radicals, many of them. It's fascinating. Therefore, Christian Smith's attack on Protestantism, I once had a lovely email from Christian Smith who told me that I would be pitiable if I were not so annoying. I took that as a real compliment at the time. I'm saving it for a jacket commendation on a book somewhere. But anyway, therefore, Christian Smith's attack on Protestantism for its pervasive interpretive pluralism, the fact that Protestantism unleashes theological hermeneutical chaos on the world, can be critiqued from various angles, but one basic point of response might be this. Pervasive interpretive pluralism is the risk one runs, nay, perhaps the inevitable outcome of, rising literacy rates. The more people have access to the Bible and can read it, the more likely it is that they will disagree about what it means. Teach 50 people to read and give them any book you want, and I bet you'll come up with at least 45 different readings. of it. There is thus an irony involved in reading the works of Notre Dame professors who, lamenting the chaos of modernity through the writings they can only produce on the grounds that they are themselves literate and can only sell them on the grounds that their audience too is literate. We might also remember here that the chaos of denominations which Protestantism has brought in its wake and which is often blamed on its lack of coherent authority is something which cannot be studied in isolation from the wider context. I believe that I think this is Charles Taylor's most brilliant insight into modernity and secularism. I believe Charles Taylor is correct in seeing choice, specifically religious choice, as lying at the very heart of our secular age. I'm going to return to that in my conclusion. Yet choice in religion is something that may have existed conceptually in the 16th century, but was difficult to realize legally in many places until the 19th and practically until the 20th. Alec, of course, mentioned Germany in the 1520s, and you have that remarkable period in England in the 1640s and 1650s, but by and large, practical religious choice was not really a reality until fairly recently. For choice to be meaningful, people had to be able to reach a variety of places of worship on a Sunday. Thus, it was really predicated on the development of cheap and easily accessible transport. The automobile caused a veritable explosion in choice, not simply on the religious front, and also shattered old-style notions of church discipline. No longer did the tight-knit, self-contained community hold the power it once did. Individuals and families with motor cars could choose where to worship and could choose how much influence or control over their lives they were willing to give to pastors and priests. And that's a relatively new development. University of being. It's always boring to talk university of being, but I feel I have to address it at some level in this. Central to Gregory's case is the shift in metaphysics which takes place at the Reformation, or he alleges takes place at the Reformation. A shift from an analogous, we might say broadly, Thomist understanding of being, of divine and created being, to a univocal understanding of the same. Of course, as Gregory points out, this shift actually occurs with Duns Scotus, a Roman Catholic of good, or a Catholic, as we would say, of good standing in the late 13th century. Gregory correctly identifies university as part of the broad metaphysical framework that facilitated the rise of modern science and therefore excluded God from discussion of the world as science conceives it. Yet Gregory overreaches when he claims that this university can be traced through the theology of the Reformers, especially in their Eucharistic views. Right. The specific example he cites is Huldrych Zwingli. It's a very remarkable statement, actually, this. I was very puzzled when I read it. Here's the quotation. Whether it was explicitly recognized by its protagonists or not, the denial that Jesus could be really present in the Eucharist, which is particularly clear, for example, in Zwingli's spatial dichotomizing of Jesus' divine and human natures, and the claim that he sits at the right hand of the Father, has left the world, is no longer among us, is a logical corollary of metaphysical univocity. A spiritual presence which is contrasted with a real presence presupposes an either-or dichotomy between a cryptospatial God and the natural world that precludes divine immanence in its desire to preserve divine transcendence. End quotation. Such a statement cries out for a response. I'm inclined to quote the great Reformation scholar Frankie Howard at this point and say, nay, nay, thrice nay. Frankie Howard was a comedian, by the way, not a Reformation scholar. For those of you unfamiliar with him, look him up on the internet. First, Luther and his followers did believe in the real presence, so this is not a uniform Protestant belief. Objectively there in the elements, to believer and unbeliever alike. So that's the first basic point. There are some Protestants who don't reject the real presence. More to the point, to claim that Zwingli's view is a logical corollary of univocity is, as I've said, a logical step too far. It may well be that the position of Zwingli is compatible with a univocal metaphysics. I'm not an astute enough philosopher to know whether that is the case or not. Whether they are necessarily connected as corollaries seems far too strong a claim. Zwingli's own position was articulated in terms of biblical exegesis and his understanding of Chalcedonian Christology. Indeed, at the great debate between the Lutherans and Zwinglians at Marburg in 1529, the testimony of the Church Fathers also played an important role in the debate. Further, the absence of Christ's humanity from the elements of bread and wine was predicated in large part by Zwingli on his assumption, which seems to me a wholly reasonable one, that a physical body could only be in one place at one time. Such a view does not seem in and of itself to demand or even to imply a univocal metaphysics. I'm not sure that you can draw many metaphysical conclusions from the statement a body can only be in one place at one time at all. One might also ask how deep Scotist and Ockhamist notions of univocity go in Orthodox Reformation Protestantism. The answer would appear to be very little, if any at all. Occam was certainly a huge influence on Luther, but it seems from my reading of Luther that it was his nominalism and his voluntarism, not his metaphysics of being, which played the key roles in the formulation of justification. The impact of Scotus on Calvin is increasingly accepted, but again it is the voluntarism, not the issue of univocity, which plays a key role. Then, if we move into the 17th century, a figure like William Twiss, first prolocutor of the Westminster Assembly, rigorous Calvinist, and scourge of contemporary Platonists, draws explicitly on Scotus for his understanding of God's will and discussions of necessity, but he explicitly repudiates Scotus's position on two metaphysical points which are typically regarded as definitive of Scotism. He accepts the real distinction between existence and essence, which Scotus rejected, and he rejects the univocity of being, which Scotus affirmed. Beyond that, in the wider frame of Reformed theologians, it is now clear from the scholarship of the last 25 years that the dominant metaphysics of being was drawn from the medieval Thomist tradition. From this angle, Reformation Protestantism actually appears as an attempt to retain the kind of metaphysics of which Gregory approves, rather than a manifestation of univocity, which his own confessional group were promoting, and not a staging post to the universe of modern science with its exclusion of the divine. We might, I think, describe with all fairness the metaphysics of the Westminster Confession as a form of scotistically modified Thomism. The Reformed saw there were a number of problems with Thomas that they sought to correct by using Scotus, but the dominant Thomist paradigm stayed in place. Whatever else it is not an example of univocity. The living and the dead. The separation of the living and dead by Protestantism is one of the points made by Ira in his connection of Protestantism to the modern disenchanted world. Again, this is a very interesting question. On one level, he is, of course, correct. Central to much Protestant polemic was the emphasis on physical death as the great watershed. Believers alive on earth were forbidden to pray to believers who had died and gone to heaven. The first part of the answer to question 94 of the Heidelberg Catechism, dealing with the teaching of the first commandment, is representative of Reformation Protestantism as a whole. Question: what does the Lord require in the first commandment? Answer: that for the sake of my very salvation, I avoid and flee all idolatry, witchcraft, superstition, and prayer to saints or to other creatures. You've got that juxtaposition there of witchcraft, superstition, and prayer to the saints. Gives you the basic Reformation Protestant position on that. Protestantism's approach to the idea of praying to dead saints is rooted in the fact that they see prayer as implying worship, and worship as to be reserved for God alone. The other area where Protestant theology clearly broke with medieval Catholicism relative to the dead was the matter of purgatory. The issue of indulgences raised by Luther clearly connects closely to this doctrine. Luther's comment on Genesis 36 verse 9 is typical of Protestant disdain for the idea of purgatory, and I quote, "In this way God gathered and preserved his church from the beginning, just as under the papacy, baptism, the keys, the Eucharist, and other pure articles of faith were retained, while the Pope in the meantime established others concerning relics, the invocation of saints, and purgatory, by which he corrupted and weakened sound doctrine." End quote. Justification by grace through faith and the imputation of Christ's righteousness rendered the doctrine of purgatory not simply redundant, therefore, but also somewhat obnoxious. Yet the fact that Protestant theology excluded traditional Catholic constructions of the relationship between living piety and the dead departed does not, I think, mean that the dead cease to be present in a sense among the living. I think there are those who dismiss Ira and Gregory on the grounds they're Roman Catholic, and therefore, their approach is bound to be, swung in some sort of Roman Catholic way, and I think that's an unfair criticism. But I think at this point what they do is they think that if you don't construct the relationship between the living and the dead in a Roman Catholic way, then you have no construction of the relationship between the living and the dead at all. And I think they're wrong on that. I quote Dylan Thomas from his very last poem, the last line of his very last poem, talking about his dead father. "Until I die, he will not leave my side." It's a beautiful statement of the presence of the dead in the world of the living. The theological separation of the living and the dead does not require the absence of the dead from among the living or their powerful impact upon the present, as a myriad photographs of dead loved ones in homes today indicate. We might also point to the proximity of graveyards to places of worship among churches, Protestant and Catholic until recently. The dead may be dead, but surely walking past one's parents' graves on the way into worship each time surely gave them some presence, some impact upon personal piety. In fact, I would suggest the increasing absence of the dead from the living in modern life surely has less to do with ideas in themselves and more to do with changes in medical care, funeral practices, and planning laws. Hospitals and hospices have become the locations for many deaths rather than the homes. Few churches are now built with graveyards. Those cemeteries which do exist are often detached from areas of what we might call public conversation. And indeed, cremation erases all presence, trace of the dead in some sense. And even if the traditional theology which connected the living and the dead together was denied by Protestantism, it is very clear that the belief in the afterlife and its connection to the present persisted, both in folk religious practices and later in movements such as spiritualism and beliefs such as reincarnation. One does not have to be an adherent of Aleister Crowley to believe the relationship between the living and the dead is a very real one. There are few, if any, places, even in the secular West, where some form of popular assumption that life continues after death does not grip many imaginations, as witnessed by the fact that mediums and seances remain a relatively lucrative business, if the presence of such, even in those bastions of secularism, the modern cities, is any evidence to go by. And that brings me to my next point, disenchantment. And disenchantment, question mark. It is also perhaps worth asking, how disenchanted did the world become as a result of Protestantism? Charles Taylor has no doubt and expresses himself on the matter with a sweeping statement of uncharacteristic conciseness. If you read Taylor, if Taylor expresses himself concisely on a point, you know that he considers it to be absolutely self-evident. He says this: everyone can agree that one of the big differences between us and our ancestors of 500 years ago is that they lived in an enchanted world and we do not. Everyone can agree. But is this really so? First, we might note that the whole idea of disenchantment depends upon the world first being enchanted. Now, that's a very tricky subject, precisely because a moment's reflection indicates that we are talking here about matters of degree, I think, and not about clean, discrete, mutually exclusive categories. The medieval peasant farmer may well have prayed to the saints to protect his crops, but he still ploughed the fields and scattered the grain, and that at certain points in the year. For the medieval farmer, therefore, crop production was to a very important degree, we might say, a disenchanted matter of technique within a relatively predictable world with regard to its seasons. And the same applies to other trades involving technical skill. The carpenters in the Middle Ages, as far as I've been able to ascertain, typically used saws to cut wood. It may have been that the same farmers and the same carpenters also believed that their prayers to the saints had an effect. But enchantment, in that case, sat happily alongside technical skill. Second, this then raises questions regarding the demystifying or disenchantment of the modern world. Now, it is one thing, I think, to lament such from a university campus dominated by materialist postmodernism. Quite another to ask that question of other contexts. The professors and students at such institutions may well be, perhaps, metaphysically more self-aware than others, but whatever the case, they are scarcely representative of society as a whole. When we come, therefore, to look at the larger social picture in the West, some interesting observations suggest themselves. Even at the time of the Reformation, an interesting contrast can be drawn between Protestant church disciplinary cases, let's say in Geneva, and those in early modern Scotland. In Geneva, a large number of cases involve theological issues or marital conflicts of some kind. One might perhaps predict that marital strife would feature highly in an urban environment where the population was more fluid and family support networks were not as extensive as in rural areas. In Scotland, however, where the same basic Reformed theology predominated, the preponderance of cases seem to have dealt with matters of what might be referred to as folk religious practices, spells, potions, etc. Of course, Roman Catholicism has typically proved more receptive to folk religious practices, but the contrast still raises a question. Is it Protestantism or urbanization which creates disenchantment in the 16th century and beyond? Certainly, folk religious practices and beliefs coexisted alongside Orthodox Protestantism in rural areas for many centuries. My wife comes from the Isle of Lewis, high Calvinist centre of the Western world, and I could take you there and introduce you to all kinds of weird stuff that's believed and goes on, even among the high Calvinists. You might witness, for example, if you want a written example of this, the writings of the 19th century Presbyterian Hugh Miller. You're reading Hugh Miller, and one minute he's talking high Calvinist theology, the next minute he's sort of telling you about the fairies at the bottom of his garden. It's fascinating stuff to read. Further, research done on the modern world has indicated that even in the West, the idea of disenchantment has been profoundly overplayed. While modern classical music and architecture may seem on the whole to lack any profound sense of mystery, anecdotally one can hardly walk down a high street or switch on the television without seeing advertisements for tarot readings and fortune tellers. I was amused this morning and walking in from the hotel, there was a banner advertising yoga classes, meditation and yoga classes, right in the middle of a secular city. In the field of medicine, surely the poster child of modern science in terms of immediate public impact, the rise and popularity of homeopathic remedies, bogus as many of them may be, seem to strike a chord with many members of the public. Again, rural areas still exhibit higher levels of what sophisticated urbanites might dismiss as folk superstition regarding the existence of such things as spirits and sprites. Add to this the mystical dimensions of some parts of the Green movement, the interest in meditation and Eastern religion, and the powerful rise of Islam and Mormonism. And might I suggest then that the difference between us and our ancestors of 500 years ago would appear to be less in the fact that our world is disenchanted and more in the sheer range of enchantments which are now on offer. Choice, not enchantment, might well be the key. Luthero remoto. Given all that has been said thus far, we might perhaps engage now in a little thought experiment along Anselmic lines, with Luthero remoto, with Luther removed. What would have happened if Luther, and to keep it ecumenical, Zwingli, had never lived? Would modernity and its malaises have been avoided? I do not think so. First, as noted above, rising literacy rates, fueled by the printing press, urbanization, and the rise of commerce, would have brought in their wake challenges to established forms of authority. Technological developments would have led, I think, to challenges of authority. We might add that commerce in itself would have done so, as it led to changes in the nature and distribution of power in Europe. But even at a more conceptual level, church authority was already in serious trouble long before Luther was even born. The multiple simultaneous popes of the late 14th and early 15th centuries surely damaged the notion of the papacy in a fundamental way. That the problem was resolved by a council merely begs the question of how that does not in itself shatter that which it sought to establish, a coherent authority built around the preeminence of the Roman pontiff. And it was me making that point in a review of Brad Gregory's book that earned me that compliment from Christian Smith that I received earlier on. I think mentioning the late 14th and early 15th century does not play well in certain circles. Second, it plays very well in my circles, I have to say, but I'm always harping on about it. Second, this conclusion, of course, points us back to the fundamental problem with Gregory's narrative. While the Reformation no doubt had unintended consequences, it is very clear that his narrative actually roots the problems in late medieval's Catholicism. The Reformation thus becomes simply one of the side effects of the failures of medieval Catholicism to maintain itself in a coherent form, rather than a first cause of the collapse of the Catholic monopoly in Western Europe. If the Reformation is to blame for the chaos of secular relativism, then by Gregory's own account, medieval Catholicism is to blame for the Reformation. Third, as noted above, pervasive interpretive pluralism is surely as much a function of literacy as it is of Protestantism. When large numbers of people can read a text, there will be disagreements over what the text means. I'm not telling the truth here. I say without wanting to score cheap denominational points. That's exactly what I'm about to do. The recent debates within Roman Catholicism over Amoris Laetitia, the 2016 post-synodal apostolic exhortation, particularly those surrounding footnote 351, indicate that Protestantism has no monopoly over contested understandings of written texts, and that papal authority is itself a contested doctrine, subject, or so it seems to outsiders, to pervasive interpretive pluralism. Fourth, and as I hinted earlier, the lacuna in the narratives presented by Taylor, Ira, and Gregory is that of how the elite ideas of university professors shape the common currency of demotic discourse in the 16th century and beyond. Certain material conditions, social, economic, technological, need to exist for certain ideas to have any practical significance. We might, for example, point to Taylor's emphasis on the shift from mimesis to poiesis as critical in the changing understanding of selfhood and the relationship of human beings to the world. But that is not simply or even primarily the result of voluntarism in thinking. It is surely just as much, if not more, the result of rising powerful technologies and economic transformations. Technology, as the Canadian thinker George Grant and as Michael Hamby have pointed out, technology is ontology. It brings with it a way of looking at the world and its possibilities and its relationship to the individual. Modern chaotic relativism for the average man or woman in the street is surely as much the product of the existence of popular mass media rooted in information technology as it is of anything Martin Luther might have written. Again, on this score, we might see the Protestant Reformation as the product of a technological media revolution rather than its cause. Fifth, was it really the Reformation that introduced choice to the religious marketplace, one of Taylor's key hallmarks of the secular world? One might say that perhaps the papacy did this in 1054, when the Pope excommunicated the ecumenical patriarch of Constantinople. One might object that this is not the case, since most would still only have had one religion on offer in their geographical locale, but there lies the rub. Yes, the Reformers certainly fueled the conceptual range of options that were available, strictly in terms of the conceptual institutionalization of different religious creeds. They also made the fragmentation of Christianity a more familiar concept. But choice still requires the ability to choose. And if we think at the practical level of daily life as experienced by most people, the choices generated by the Reformation were not real choices at all. There was no real religious choice in Calvin's Geneva, or in Luther's Wittenberg, or in Bullinger's Zurich. In England, the Book of Common Prayer was imposed with draconian penalties in the reigns of Edward VI, Elizabeth, James I, Charles I, and Charles II. Even in England, until the 19th century, those who dissented from the Church of England were subject to social marginalization and sporadic judicial persecution. Surely it was only with the rise of colonial and then revolutionary, maybe I should call it rebellious America from my own perspective, that religious choice started to become a real practical possibility. And even then, for most people, it was the invention of the internal combustion engine, with its shattering of the power of geography, that made religious choice a true option. Conclusion. And there's more to... I want to say I've given in any way an exhaustive answer certainly to Gregory and Ira on this issue, but I hope I've poked enough holes in some of what they've said to give you pause for thought. There is no doubt that the traditional triumphalist reading of the significance of the Reformation is now under considerable strain. The great unravelling of Western civilization, or perhaps to put it in more neutral terms, its dramatic remodelling, is taking place rapidly all around us. And therein lies the problem, at least with the narratives of Ira and Gregory. It is very clear that they disapprove of modernity in its Western form and are looking for culprits to blame. And the Reformation is a useful target. But the question is this: as we are beneficiaries of things such as universal education, literacy and technology, and would presumably wish to affirm that each of these things has done at least some good, I would want to say they've done immense good. Can we have these benefits without at least a very high risk of the problems? Can we have universal education and literacy without challenges to traditional authority or vigorous disagreements in the public square? Can we have, say, the freedom which the automobile provides without the industrialization that at least risks something like the organized murder of the Holocaust or the technologized warfare that places civilians at risk as never before? Bewailing the times in which we live and finding people, generally not ourselves, to blame is a time-honoured practice. This is perhaps where I would give Charles Taylor the edge over the other advocates of the "it was the reformers what done it" tabloid headline. Taylor describes and explains more than he blames and decries. I would suggest that such an approach is appropriate. Yes, we are remembering an important anniversary this year, but like all anniversaries of its kind, it is neither a cause of unalloyed rejoicing nor blanket lamentation. It is more complicated than that. And if all that we do is some version of the blame game, we will not have truly benefited from what careful reflection upon the Reformation can really tell us about why our world is the way it is. To close, and to end by sounding like a hackneyed Christian cliché monger, let me use the words of another Roman Catholic writer, J.R.R. Tolkien. Chapter 2 of the Fellowship of the Ring, Gandalf and Frodo discuss the darkness of the times in which they live. Their words would seem most applicable to those of us perhaps dismayed by much of what is happening in the world around us, and who might be tempted to spend our lives indulging in that sterile form of nostalgia, the retrospective blame game, rather than using our analyses of the past to better understand and better engage the present. I quote, "I wish it need not have happened in my time," said Frodo. "So do I," said Gandalf, "and so do all who live to see such times. But that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given to us."